Okay, so now that we've talked about the arguments for psychological egoism, I want to move on to ethical egoism. Ethical egoism being this view that morally we should act from self-interest. We should be selfish. Well, ethical egoism is a pretty shocking doctrine, right? Because, normally we think that morality tells us that sometimes we should do things that are against our self-interest, right? Do them to help others. Ethical egoism actually says, well, no, the morally right thing to do is whatever's in your self-interest. Now look, one thing I'll note here that Rachel's doesn't is that shocking claims often are really good at grabbing our attention, right? Here's the thing though, generally speaking, the more shocking, the more surprising a claim is, the better argument you're going to need to accept it, right? The more shocking a claim is, the more attention it's going to grab, the more people are going to talk about it. Controversy works in philosophy as well as the 6 o'clock news. But again, if you're making a radical, surprising claim, you're going to need darn good arguments to establish it. Well, what kinds of arguments do we have for ethical egoism? Rachel's considers 3 of them. The altruism is self-defeating argument, the Rand argument, and the ethical egoism fits with common sense morality. Now, I want to go through each of these in detail. Along with Rachel's, I actually think that 1 and 2 are pretty bad and that 3 is the best of the lot. I'm going to give 3 a bit more of a hearing than he does. I ultimately think 3 won't work. 3 is this attempt to show that actually, despite the appearance of conflict, ethical egoism fits with common sense morality, maybe even does a good job of explaining it. I think there are moral theories that'll go a little further, that'll do a better job of trying to show this than Rachel's thinks. I still think that they're going to ultimately not hold up. But so we'll put those to the last. We'll talk about the first 2, which, just to lay my cards on the table, I don't think are great arguments. Well, let's talk about this altruism is self-defeating argument, right? Rachel's gives a few claims that people give in support. These are my shortened versions of these. Each of us best suited to look out for our own wants and needs. I am best suited to take care of myself. Just, the position I occupy, I can do the most for myself. And hey, guess what? I am the best judge. I know best what's good for me, right? If other people try to help me out, they're not going to be as good at it because they're not going to know as well or be able to do as well as I am at providing for myself, right? 2 kind of hooks up with the first one. Looking out for others intrudes in their lives, right? If we try to help other people, it's just going to be bad for them. It'll meddle in their lives. Finally, charity is degrading to others. If someone is an object of charity, it puts them below the person who's helping them. That's really hard to swallow, right? All right. So let's look at these and look at this argument that altruism is self-defeating. So the argument says we ought to do whatever best promotes everyone's interests. Best way to promote everyone's interests is for each to exclusively pursue his or her own interests. Therefore, each of us should pursue our own interests exclusively. Now think about this argument. Now remember, what Vaughan said, moral arguments are always going to have a moral premise, or at least one. What's the moral premise of this argument? And ask yourself this, is the moral premise of this argument actually an egoistic premise? Well, it isn't, right? The moral premise is premise 1, right? We ought to do whatever best promotes everyone's interests. Well, that premise isn't based on egoism. It's actually based on the interests of everybody, right? So the argument that altruism is self-defeating actually really isn't an argument for ethical egoism when you look at it, right? What it's an argument for is that, the best way to look out for everyone's interests, the best way, maybe even you might say, to be altruistic is to be an egoist, right? So even if this argument works, it actually turns out not to be an argument for ethical egoism, right? The first premise makes reference to the good of everybody, the interests of everybody, so it's not really an egoistic argument. Now, Rachel's doesn't really talk about this, but I actually think that we can go deeper and say, well, the argument doesn't even work, right? Look at 2. The best way to promote everyone's interests is for each to exclusively pursue their own interests. Now, I think 2 goes back to these claims about altruism being self-defeating, and I think these aren't going to hold up, at least not in all cases when we really look at them, right? Is it really true that each of us is best suited to look out for our own wants and needs? Well, of course not, right? At least not in all cases. Often we might be, generally we might be, but, look, if I'm in an accident and I'm unconscious and I'm laying on the street bleeding, and you see me unconscious bleeding and you have a phone where you can call help, you are obviously in a much better position to look out for my wants and needs than I am in this particular case, right? Or in the case Rachel's gives, look, think about people who are starving or who can't get good medical care, even the basics of medical care in poorer countries, right? They can't even get antibiotics or clean water, right? Obviously, if you or I have money we could give to charity, we are much better situated to help these people than they are themselves, right? We have money, they don't. We can think about 2 or 3, looking out for others' intrudes in their lives. Well, look, if I'm bleeding on the sidewalk and you intrude in my life, well, I think I would say thank you, right? That's not an intrusion that meddles or is bad, right? Charity is degrading to others. Well, maybe sometimes, right? But if you are drowning in the ocean and someone throws you a life preserver or a rope, you would be an odd person when you get to the shore if you're like, man, you've degraded me. That's so embarrassing that you helped. Why did you do that, right? No, right? In a lot of cases, charity is not degrading. It's just decent. We wouldn't feel degraded, right? We wouldn't feel like the other person has put themselves above us. And even if we did, come on, right? Even if I'm embarrassed that I need help from somebody else to keep from drowning or bleeding to death on the sidewalk, well, the embarrassment's a small price to pay for not drowning or bleeding to death, right? Even if it is degrading, charity might be a good thing, a thing that we want. So the altruism is self-defeating argument, even if it worked, wouldn't actually be an argument for egoism, for ethical egoism, as Rachel's points out. But when you really look more closely at it, it just doesn't work, right? Look at these claims about exclusively or always, right? Maybe generally we create the most happiness by pursuing our own interests, maybe not, but it's certainly not the case that we always do, right? Sometimes other people's interests are going to be well promoted by us helping them. So let's move on to Ayn Rand's argument. Now, as Rachel's points out, Ayn Rand is not taken terribly seriously by most philosophers. Honestly, he kind of gives an understatement. We kind of think Rand is a joke for the most part. Rand is famous because the main reason she wrote some books people likes, but Donahue, this talk show host, really loved to have her on his TV show. And he liked to have her on his TV show because Rand was very good on TV. Now, maybe I shouldn't spend this time to beat up on Rand, but I'll just note there's a big difference between being able to seem like you're a smart person on TV and actually being a smart person. Ayn Rand was very good at seeming like she was a smart person on TV. If you actually read her arguments and look at, how she tried to prove her claims, well, I don't think there's any good evidence that Ayn Rand was actually a smart person. Good at playing one on TV. In real life, not so much, right? Anyway, whatever, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm being too harsh on Rand, but that's generally the opinion of most philosophers. If you want a better argument for the kinds of things Rand says, this philosopher Robert Nozick is, I would say, basically what Ayn Rand would have been had Ayn Rand actually been a smart person. But whatever, I'll put that aside. Interested in defending these kind of claims, go look at Nozick. You're not going to find great arguments for it in Rand. Anyway, so let's look at Rand's actual argument. Each person, Rachel's gives a very short, a longer version. This is my own very shortened version of Rachel's summary. If you look at Rand, this is a pretty fair summary of the kinds of things she actually says. So, Rand's argument. Each person only has one life to live. If we value the individual, we must admit that life is of supreme importance. The ethics of altruism regards the life of the individual as something that may be sacrificed for the good of others, so it doesn't take seriously the value of the individual. Rand's thought seems to be, the ethics of altruism says that, I should, if you need me to help you at the cost of my own life, I should just jump and do that, right? Or, if you need part of a liver, even if I don't know you, I should just go out and sacrifice my liver, even if it's bad for me, right? That seems to be what Rand thinks. Ethical egoism, which allows each person to view his or her own life as being of ultimate value, does take the individual seriously. Rand will claim it's the only philosophy that does. Thus, ethical egoism is the philosophy we ought to accept. Well, look, here's the problem. Rand's argument is actually fallacious. It commits really the whole argument depends on a very common fallacy. You'll hear this described sometimes as the fallacy of false choice, sometimes as a false dichotomy. Fallacy of false choice actually is, maybe the more accurate term. The false dichotomy is just a type of the fallacy of false choice. And what the fallacy of false choice does is it arbitrarily narrows down the options. And usually this takes the form of a false dichotomy. There are a bunch of different options, and the person making the argument narrows it down to two really opposed ones. And they usually set this up in a way that one of them is clearly better, right? Here's an example of a false dichotomy different from Rand's, right? Someone might be talking about whether we should intervene in the Syrian civil war, right? And they might say, well, look, it's obvious our only two options are either to full on send our own troops into Syria or do nothing. Obviously, sending our own troops in is a bad idea. We don't want to sacrifice American lives. That might escalate things and start a war with Russia, which would be terrible. So we shouldn't do anything. Problem here is that there are plenty of things in between doing absolutely nothing and sending our own troops in, right? We could aid the Syrian rebels. We can put pressure on the Syrian government. We can put pressure on Russia not to help Syria so much, right? there are a lot of things that we can do in between send in troops and do nothing, right? And this argument is a bad one because it doesn't consider any of those things in between. Well, that's the problem with Rand's argument. She gives us two really opposed choices and doesn't consider the things in between. So Rand seems to think, well, we either choose between giving absolutely no preference to ourselves, sacrificing anything we might value to help others if they need it. We have to choose between that, extreme altruism, and being egoists. Here's the thing, though. Most moral theories, we'll talk a lot more about this as the semester goes on, but most moral theories will say that, yes, you should take account of the interests of others, but you can also give some preference to people near and dear to you, right? Look, if I could save the life of another person by taking 5 minutes out of my day and calling 911 while they're bleeding on the sidewalk, I should do that, right? I should take that much account of their interests. That doesn't mean that I have to be an extreme altruist who takes no account or no preference for my own interests, right? It's perfectly consistent with saying, well, we should value the interests of others to some degree with saying we can give ourselves preference, right? Look, if I have an extra $500 and a friend of mine would be really happy to have some extra money, he doesn't need it, but he would really like to have some extra money, I'm not required to split my $500 and give him $250 just because that $250 would make him happy, right? I'm allowed to give some preference to myself. Now, if he needed that $250 to save his life, then I might be under some real obligation to give it to him. I have to take some account of his interests, but I can give some preference to my own, right? Most moral theories won't deny that. They won't go for the extreme altruism Rand says they advocate. And if they don't, then her theory very much sets up a false dichotomy. So, the whole argument, she's not really considering the moral theories that say we have to take some account of the interests of others. She's setting up a stupid position, showing that's wrong, and acting like her theory is the only alternative to this stupid position. But it's not, so Rand's argument isn't a good one. Now, probably the best example of an argument for ethical egoism are the attempts to make ethical egoism fit with common sense morality. Rachel considers Hobbes. And Hobbes is a pretty good example of this. If you want to think about the Hobbesian attempt to do this, just go look at Rachel's. I actually think there's an even better one in the Epicureans. The Epicureans were philosophers in ancient Greece, and the Epicureans tried to develop an egoistic philosophy. And they tried to show that egoism, ethical egoism, actually fits with common sense morality. And I actually think they do a surprisingly good job. So I think it's worth thinking about Epicurean egoism, even though Rachel's doesn't, just so we give egoism a fair shake. So Epicurean egoism says people should only pursue their self-interest. But Epicurean egoism also says that most people are really bad at this. In fact, most people really stupidly misunderstand what their self-interest is. And the reason that it looks like self-interest is at odds with common sense morality, or so says the Epicurean, is that most people don't know what their self-interest is and do a bad job of pursuing their self-interest. Well, what's the Epicurean picture? Well, the Epicurean will say, well, the first thing we need to do is to figure out what is self-interest actually. And I think that's actually really, not to make a bad pun, but that's a really interesting point. We kind of throw these terms like self-interest around and we don't ask ourselves, well, what do they actually mean, right? And I think we should. And the Epicurean will say, well, look, to figure out what self-interest is, we need to ask ourselves another question. What is it that makes people's lives go well or badly? What makes a person's life go well? And the Epicurean will say, well, what makes someone's life go well? Pleasure and the absence of pain. So the interests of everybody, what is somebody's interest? Well, if pleasure and the absence of pain are what make people's lives go well, then what is in each person's interest is to feel the most pleasure and the least pain, right? So what would it be to act in your own self-interest? You want to feel the most pleasure and the least pain in your own life. Now, it's actually interesting when we get to utilitarianism, they all say the same thing about what makes people's lives go well. But unlike the Epicurean, the utilitarian will say people shouldn't act just for self-interest. They'll say we should take account of the interests of others, but their account of what is in people's interests actually matches the Epicurean one. We'll talk about this more when we get to Mill. It's actually called hedonism. The idea is pleasure and the absence of pain are what is important in life. Well, as the Epicurean will say, think about what will bring you the most pleasure and the least pain. The Epicurean will say, well, when you think about this, it turns out that most people do a really bad job of pursuing their self-interest because they pursue things that bring them pain and they don't pursue things that would bring them the most pleasure. And so the Epicurean will say, think about the pursuit of money or luxury or status, right? Status being you're a big, important person. Well, most of the things you have to do to earn a lot of money aren't terribly pleasant, right? And if you have money, you've got to worry about losing your money. So the Epicurean will say, if you're obsessed with making money, you're going to feel a lot of stress, a lot of pain, because they'll count psychological pain as well. You're going to feel a lot of stress that you wouldn't feel if you're not so obsessed with money. Luxury, something very similar. If you are the kind of person who wants steak and lobster for every meal, if you come to expect that, or you expect that you have to have a BMW or a Mercedes, well, guess what? You're going to be frustrated and unhappy when you can't get those things. Those things are very hard to get, right? Same thing goes for status. It's hard to be a big, important person. Guess what else? If you are a big, important person, generally some people under you will resent it. They'll want your position. You'll have a target on your back, right? It's a lot of work. It's very stressful. The Epicurean will say, again, obsessing about these things doesn't bring the most pleasure and the least pain. And the Epicurean will say, well, think about it. Most people think that egoists would pursue money, luxury, status, power. Turns out they won't. So they won't do these awful things to others that you might have to do to get money or luxury or status, right? So egoism won't lead to terrible behavior, or at least the Epicurean will say it won't, in the way that people think it does. The second thing the Epicurean will say is people undervalue the things that tend to bring them pleasure and prevent pain. So some good examples are friends and simple pleasures, right? We enjoy being around other people. Other people, friends, help us also to avoid pain, right? They help us in times of need. So the Epicurean will say, a good egoist will cultivate real friendships because it's pleasant to have friends. They'll also cultivate real friendships and they'll help their friends when they need it, even if it's not in their short-term self-interest, because long-term, you want to have the kind of friends who might help you out. You'll do unpleasant stuff like help your friends move because you want them to help you in the future, right? You'll cultivate simple pleasures, you know, a walk in the park or a simple meal or being with your friends because those are easy to get. They don't tend to bring pain. So that's what egoism will really look like, says the Epicurean. So I think the Epicurean can do a surprisingly good job of showing, well, maybe egoism, ethical egoism, lines up with common sense morality more than you might think. The Epicurean can tell us why it's a bad idea to murder, lie, steal to try to get money or power, right? That's not just bad for others, it sets us up to be frustrated, harmed in the long run, to feel unnecessary pain and deprives us of pleasure. The Epicurean can say why we should help others, cultivate real friendships, because if we help others, they'll help us. If we have real friendships, friendships will make us happy. Why do you help your friend move or help your friend when doing so is unpleasant in some other way? Well, because your friend will help you in the future. All right. Here's the problem, though. In a lot of cases, Epicureanism can show that its account of self-interest, we might call this an enlightened account of self-interest. Epicureanism can show that self-interest lines up with common sense morality. Common sense morality says you should help your friends out. Well, Epicurean self-interest says you should help your friends out, right? Epicurean self-interest says you shouldn't lie, cheat, or steal. Common sense morality says don't lie, cheat, or steal, especially to get things like money or luxuries. Epicureanism says the same thing. The problem is when we push Epicureanism hard enough, it seems to depart from common sense morality in some pretty big ways. I mean, imagine this. Imagine that your friend is sick and in the hospital and he's dying. You could comfort him. You could make his passing a lot easier if you go visit him. But it's not very much fun to go to the hospital, right? And now in most cases, the Epicurean would say, well, you should help your friend because your friend will help you in the future and you want to maintain the relationship because it's good to have friends. Well, the case where your friend is sick in the hospital, neither of those things hold, right? Your friend's not going to be able to visit you in the hospital in the future because he's going to be dead. You aren't going to be able to maintain the relationship no matter what because the person's going to die. So even though it would really help your friend, even though common sense morality would say if this person's a close friend, you should go visit, especially if there's no risk to you, Epicureanism seems like it would be forced to say, well, it's going to bring you pain just going to the hospital, which is unpleasant, even more pain seeing your friend in this terrible position, and it's not going to bring you pleasure in the long term. Don't go visit, right? That seems very much at odds with common sense morality. Or imagine, and again, this is a kind of artificial case. I'm sorry, philosophers have to use artificial cases. Sometimes it makes the point clear. So bear with me, right? Imagine some evil supervillain type person says, look, I'm going to give you a choice. I'm going to do something that really, not terrible, but really hurts to you. You know, let's say he had put out a cigarette, lit cigarette in the palm of your hand. That would be really painful, right? That would give you a nasty burn. It would hurt at the time. Burn would take some time to heal, right? So either you can let me do this pretty painful thing to you, or I'm going to release poison gas half a world away and kill a village of 5,000 people you've never met. Now look, most of us would say, we probably wouldn't like the choice. Most of us would say, if that really your choice is get burned or let 5,000 people die, you should let yourself get burned, right? If you don't like that, we can make the injury more minor, right? The supervillain might say, I'm going to jab you in the palm with a hat pin, right? Hat pin, that's going to hurt for a few minutes, but it'll be over with, right? I'm going to jab you in the palm of the hand with a hat pin or kill these 5,000 people. Obviously, common sense morality would say, choose getting stuck with a hat pin over letting 5,000 people die, right? Epicureanism couldn't say that. All it could say is, well, if you have to watch them die, that might be unpleasant. Maybe that's good for you in the long term. But if these are people you're never going to meet, and if you say to the supervillain, well, do I have to watch it? And he's like, no, you can if you want, just to make, I'm telling the truth. You can verify, but you don't have to, right? It seems like the Epicurean would say, let these 5,000 people die. That is very much not fitting with common sense morality. So Epicureanism and some other forms of ethical egoism seem like they can do a better job than you might think lining up with common sense morality, but ultimately, when you really push them, they're going to come apart from common sense morality, and they're going to come apart from common sense morality in pretty big ways. So ethical egoism, even the more subtle, more refined, enlightened forms of ethical egoism, when push comes to shove, don't seem to fit with common sense morality. Now, one question we might ask ourselves, one question that might be important to keep in the back of our heads, what do we mean by self-interest? And that's a question I want to come back to. When we get to Aristotle, he'll have an interesting account of what self-interest is, and we really should ask ourselves, what do we mean by this? But at least for the time being, for everything we've seen, even enlightened egoism like Epicureanism that defines self-interest in a pretty subtle way isn't going to be able to fit with common sense morality to make egoism and common sense morality compatible.